Thanks for joining in as we continue along in our series of the coming of Christ, his reign, and his wrath. Today we will be talking about God's recompense, part 3. We've entered into this next section in the book of Revelation dealing with recompense because we talked about this ideal of judgment to those who has poured out the blood of the saints, who have done harm to God's people in the telling of this great tribulation we covered a few weeks back. And now, on the heels of this great tribulation, we talked about these interlude passages. These interlude passages that gave us this transition of showing those who have died for their faithful testimony, those who have remained true and who have done good deeds on earth, and their good deeds now follow them into heaven. They are now seen in this heavenly throne room, and they are now rejoicing in their reward for their faithfulness that came to them through death. Right? We saw in the Great Tribulation that they were handed over to the beast, and they were persecuted, and they experienced trials, and they remained faithful even until death. That is how the faithful of God experience victory. So we saw that, but we also saw this ideal of God's judgment coming to those who had poured out this tribulation and poured out the blood of the saints. We see that God now separates two groups of people, which we've always seen these two groupings of people throughout the book of Revelation, those who are God's people and those who are those of the serpent, those of the unholy trinity. And in that separation, one group, the latter group, went to the great winepress of God. And so last week, we got into looking at God's first depictive story of this great wrath, this judgment that is poured out in Revelation 16 on a physical earth, physical seas, and the nations mainly. And then we see in the latter of Revelation 16, it gets into describing how those bowls of wrath that was being poured out now is instigating this great war for the day of the Lord. And so now this week in Revelation 17, I will submit to you that we are going to get another retelling, a recapitulation of the event of God's recompense, the events of God's judgment. But now the focal point is not going to be on the physical earth or the physical sea or the nations. Now the focal point is going to be on what I would say spiritual things, a worldview that is counter God, that goes against God, a worldview that contrasts the difference between the Holy Trinity and the unholy Trinity. And those who embrace this ideal that comes along with this worldview of wanting to usurp God and wanting to indulge in all their sensualities and wanting to indulge in their fallen nature that replaces God in their lives. And so I believe this week we're going to see a different perspective of God's judgment. And so this is when I talk about recapitulation or retelling of things versus chronological events. And I'm going to show you why and how I interpret the scriptures in a certain way so that we understand rightly how to divide God's word and how we know that this is something that's a literal chronicle event opposed to a symbolic retelling of the same story that is emphasizing something completely different or a different aspect of God's judgment. All right, so let's hop over to the presentation view. All right, so I was just exploring a few different translations, but let me hop over to my old reliable NESB, and I'm going to use the 1995. All right, so in Revelation 17, just a little, well, before we get into Revelation 17, just a little recap. So remember, last week we saw these 6 bowls of wrath, right? And these 6 bowls of wrath was poured out onto the earth, right? The first bowl was poured out onto the earth. The second bowl was poured out on the seas. The third one was poured out on the fresh waters. And then the fourth one was poured out on those who were blaspheming God, those who essentially were against God, those who have received, let's say, those who have received the mark of the beast, those who persecuted God's people. And we know this is true. We know the recompense is rooted in a repayment to those who have done harm, repaying them from the harm they brought against the saints of God. Why? It says in verse 5 right here, and I heard the angel of the water saying, righteous are you who are and who were, O Holy One, because you judge these things. For they pour out the blood of the saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. And so what we see here is that they deserve it because of their deeds in pouring out the blood of the saints. Now God, in this third bowl, has given them blood. He's poured out this wrath on the waters and turned the waters and the fresh waters, the drinking waters, into what it describes as blood for them to drink. Right? And so we see, instead of indirect harm that's coming in the first 3 bowls, in the fourth bowl we get direct harm that comes against those who, again, poured out the blood of the saints, also who blasphemed the name of God, who has the power over these plagues. And it says, he poured that on them, this fourth bowl, and it was given to it to scorch men with fire. Right? So this is direct harm, repaying those who have brought harm, who's dealt out affliction and harm to the saints. And then we see in the latter bowls, the 5th and the 6th, it is preparing a way for what we call this great war, this great war that we have seen throughout Scripture, especially if you look at Ezekiel 38, Ezekiel 39. But now it's talking about how it is preparing this great war. And in here, it's the first time we see, now it talks about spiritual things. But here it's talking about it in such a way where it's telling you who instigates, like what is God doing to bring out what it called these kings of the world to come up against him for war. This is going to be important to what we read today because, again, I point to you that this is a retelling, a recapitulation, because it's talking about the same events, but it's giving you different symbols and emphasizing on different things, but it's still hearkening on the same events. And then we see the 7th bowl of wrath. And in the 7th bowl of wrath, we see it is a great hailstorm, great earthquake, and it's extremely severe. So again, in the majority of the bowls of wrath, in all of the bowls of wrath, the bowls actually brings out things that cause physical harm directly of events that happen on the earth, right? Now, when we get into Revelation 17, we start off and it reads, then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me. Now, I want to pause right here because there's something very important that I think we need to understand before we go on. And this is something that gives me indication to this is a retelling. So when it says, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls, so this connects us back to Revelation 16 and the bowls of wrath. However, when we look at this had, we might think it's talking about, it's giving us indication of, okay, he no longer has the bowls, and this is now some sort of new chronological event that comes after. Opposed to, I believe the reason why it's translated had is not that it's a chronological event that comes after, or opposed to now, after the telling of this story, now John is about to get another depiction, a different story after he just received one vision. And now he's going to get this depiction, right? However, that's important because this hat is not really a past, not giving you indication to a past tense event as the first way of interpreting this I would describe. If you understand this in a literal chronological event order, now you're thinking that this seven bowl is basically saying is depicting that this the event of what happened in Revelation 16 is past tense to some new events that's about to happen right now. And that's not the case. Well, how do I know that? Let's look at this in the interlinear in the Greek, right? It reads, and came one of the seven angels, this word ekaton, having. And you see, it's an ongoing present action. If we look at the Greek grammar for this, it's a verb, it's present. It's present, and it's a participle. And so that tells us that this is an ongoing present action that has active impact, right? And so when we read this, we should interpret this in a way in which this is a present him having the seven bowls, right? It's not something that says he doesn't have the seven bowls anymore because it's a past tense chronological event. Opposed to basically what it's doing is pointing back and it's saying who's talking to John right here is the seventh angel who had the seventh bowl in the retelling of the story I just gave you. Right now he's about to get another retelling, but he is the angel that has the seven bowl, right? And that's who's speaking to John right now. So it may seem a little complex, but it's an important point to understand when you're trying to discern if this is a retelling, recapitulation, or is this some type of chronological new event that's being introduced, right? Now we're going to get some other indicators that tells us this should not be read as a chronological new event, but that's one of the first things that jumps out to me. All right, so it reads, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, come here. So now there's this dialogue that's about to happen, this conversation that John is about to receive something new. I will show you the judgment of the great harlot. So now we know what John is about to get a depiction of, judgment. Well, hold up. We just saw in Revelation 16, well, what was this story about? It was about God's judgment, right? You judge these things, for they poured out the blood of the saints and the prophets, and you have given them blood to drink, right? So again, these are different depictions of something that was introduced, this ideal of concept of judgment that comes on the heels of the Great Tribulation, right? That's first given in Revelation 14, when we get this depiction of the two reapers, right? There's two reapings that's done. And in the latter reaping, we see this cluster that is thrown into the great winepress of the wrath of God. Verse 19. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. Again, another indication that this judgment is coming to the earth. All right, so let's continue along in Revelation 17. And it says, come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. So who is this judgment pertaining to right now? Well, now this idea of the great harlot. Now, this should hearken us back onto a lot of depictions of judgments and admonishments that we see in the Old Testament when God is announcing wrath upon either his peoples or nations who have had this similar worldview of evil and wickedness, who usurp him as God and follow after their own desires. Basically, they embrace their fallen nature, the worldview of their fallen nature. And he refers to them as harlots, adulterers. We see in Proverbs, there's this ideal of two different women you can follow, right? There's one woman who leads you to a path of life, and then there's one woman who leads you to a path of destruction, and she is depicted as a harlot, a prostitute, right? And so this is what this is giving us allusions to. All right. And it says, with whom the kings of the earth commit acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. All right, so we now see the impacts of the great harlot. One, it describes her as sitting on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality. So it's almost as this is who they are aligned with. They are the kings of the earth, the leaders of the earth, those who are opposed to God. And now it's bringing another concept, those kings. Remember, who's coming up against God in a great war? Kings, right? In the Old Testament, when God announced judgment on Babylon, he announces judgment on a king of Babylon, the king of Persia, right? All of these things point to is symbols in which God used to point to his judgment on a corrupt nation and people, right? Rulers. And so it says, they committed acts of immorality with this great harlot. And those who dwell on earth were made drunk with the wine of her. It's giving you this depiction is that those on the earth, you see now those on the earth, they consume. It's almost as if they consume this great harlot, right? And what she had to give them. It's something they partook in, right? And so it says, who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. They were engrossed, they were overindulged in her immorality, right? This what I'm going to call a worldview. This is what they were embraced into, right? And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. So now there's a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So again, we see this ideal of blasphemous. Like in Revelation 16, it says, who did we see blaspheme God? Well, it was the nations, right? So it says men were scorched with fierce heat, and they blasphemed the name of God, who has the power over these plagues. And so now we get this depiction of the harlot full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Again, so we now get these different symbols introduced to us. Verse 4, the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and of unclean things of immorality. So it's as if this woman, she possesses what seems to be the riches, right? The lavish things of the world, right? These pearls, but then it describes her hand as a gold cup full of abominations, unclean things, immorality, right? Why is it conveying all these things? I think we're going to see that a little bit later. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abomination of the earth. What do I think about? Now I introduce this idea of Babylon the Great. We should be familiar because it describes Babylon as a city, as a woman full of immorality. In Revelation 11, we saw this idea introduced of this holy city. The nations have been given over. The nations, the outside of the temple courts have been given over to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months, right? And I will grant authority to my two witnesses. So we see this ideal of the cities and nations, and then it talks about this great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt. So now the city is not mentioned to be Babylon there, but it's mentioned to be Sodom and Egypt, where also the Lord was crucified. So the same idea, the same concept, that God is referring to these places that has been given over to this worldview that is counter opposed to him, that usurps God, that embraces in immorality and abominations, right? And the next thing that comes to mind when we think about Babylon, the great harlot, well, when is the first place we notice we get an idea of Babylon? Well, in Genesis 11, we see it talks about the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into the heavens, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." So we see that the peoples of the earth are coming, uniting as one, and they come up with this ideal, and the ideal is for them to strive to reach the heavens. To reach the heavens, right? To make for themselves a name. They want greatness. They want to strive for the place of God. God is the one who issues out name, purpose, authority. But they have come up with this plan to build this tower, to build something to reach up into the heavens, into the position of where God dwells, right? And so you say, well, what's the problem with that? Everything seems fine. There's unity, they're united, they're doing one. It seems like they're doing something good. But what happens? The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, "Behold, they are one people." Okay, what's wrong with that? They seem united. And they all have the same language. Cool, that's good. And that is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. And you might say, well, okay, God, what's wrong with that? Nothing that they purpose to do will be impossible for them. And you might say that, man, that all seems like good things. Then it says, God says, come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And so I believe what you see here, and you say, well, why did God thwart their plans? Again, it's because this ideal in their behavior of becoming God and coming up and acting according to their own purposes. And God's purpose was contrary to their purpose. And so God acted to fulfill his plan and purpose, opposed to what they, using their own knowledge of good and evil, was coming up with. So it's highlighting this worldview that was introduced in the fall, in which now man has their own knowledge of good and evil, and they're acting in this independent fashion. This thing that some of us think is good, we like to call it free will. But that's not the worldview that allows you to have eternal life, right? And so again, I'm saying that to mention because I believe this is what the depiction of this judgment is really about. It's really on this system, this worldview that's being symbolically described as a woman. And right now, God describes her as Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, so let me stop right there. Well, again, where do we get this from? The woman drunk with the blood of the saints. Well, in Revelation 16, we just saw it talked about God pouring out wrath on the fresh waters, so that those who dwell on the earth, who received the mark of the beast, who poured out the blood of the saints and prophets, he says, I now give you blood to drink, right? So now, instead of it talking about those on the earth, now we see this being levied to this woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. So now it is pointing or is levying the crime of killing the saints against this woman, right? So which is it? Is it the people of the nations that deserve to receive God's recompense? Or is it, if you take this woman to be literal, is it the woman, this literal woman? And this is why I see this as a symbolic, figurative, metaphorical usage of woman, right? To talk about the worldview of those who are on the earth, embraced, that received the mark of the beast, who persecuted and killed the saints. So when you understand it that way, there's no confusion because it's one and the same. Here in this depiction, it is just God talking about or focusing on the worldview in the symbolic woman language that is not foreign to Scripture. It's used in other places in Scripture, especially in the Old Testament when you look at God's judgment against his own people and against anyone who embraces this fallen nature and act according to their nature of usurping God in their lives, right? And then he says, when I saw her, I wondered greatly. So now John says, I saw her and I wondered greatly. And the angel said to me, why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. So now the angel is about to give John interpretation of what he just gave him a depiction of. Verse 8, the beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come out of the abyss and go to destruction. Right? So it was and it is about to come out of the abyss and go into destruction. Now, we saw beasts back in Revelation 13. One coming out of the sea, one coming out of the earth. Right? And now it gives us this was and is not and is about to come. Right? So it's almost as if it's saying one was, one is no longer, and one is about to come. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast. So again, the beast is going to have some impact in his effectiveness is going to be with those who it says whose name has not been written in a book of life from the foundation of the world. Now, this is something that should challenge your theology, right? So let's think about this. It's as if God saying this is predetermined. Those who will follow the beast, who will wonder at the beast, are those whose name hasn't been written in the book of life. It's those who don't have eternal life. And from when did this book have these names? When did these names get jotted down? Well, it says from the foundation of the world, right? It's not something that, oh, well, you know what? If they make the right decisions, if they make a good decision, then God will just add it to the, no. God is saying, look, those whose names haven't been written in the book of life, they will wonder. This is predetermined. It's decreed. And then it says, here is the mind which has wisdom. Which has wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. So we see these figures of 7 heads, and then it says are 7 mountains. So now the 7 heads are described as 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And they are 7 kings. Now the 7 is something else. It says now the 7, which was described as 7 mountains, are 7 kings. Now we get another description. 5 have fallen. So 5 of the 7 has fallen. 1 is. The other has not yet come. 1 is, the other has not yet come. So the first thing we need to understand, we know that we're talking about figurative, symbolic things, that we should not take these things literal, is because, as I always tell you, when you see the figures starts to change, 7 heads, then the 7 becomes 7 mountains, right, on which the woman sits. And then it says there are 7 kings, right? So that means the 7 has changed multiple times. Heads, mountains, kings. And then it changes yet again, because it says 5 has fallen, 1 is. So 7. 5 was, 1 is, and 1 is to come. Right? But the one that is, you know, we saw the beast being described as was, is not, and is. Right? So it says if this is not, has been taken out of the picture. But here now it says these 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. When he comes, he must remain a little while. This language we also have seen before. So the question is, what is it? Who is he? What is this talking about? In fact, man, Angel, I thought we were supposed to be getting some clarification. It sounds like you're giving us more riddles, right? There's supposed to be an explanation. One is the other has not yet come, right? And when he comes, he must remain a little while. And it says, the beast which was and is not, is himself also an eighth, and is one of the seven. And he goes to destruction. So who is the one, who is the beast? Well, the beast is one of the seven. Well, which one of the seven? I'm going to put to you the beast is symbolically all the seven, because the beast is referring to the serpent. But the seventh is the one that is to come, and he goes to destruction. I said, where do we get this language from? Where do we see this language that started in verse 10, that he must remain for a little while? Well, go back to chapter 12, and go down, and this is how you connect the serpent here. So in the depiction of this great war, which is another depiction of this great tribulation just spanning throughout all of creation's time, in verse 12, after the serpent has been thrown, casted down, it says, for this reason rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. Right? He's come down knowing that he only has a short time. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. So we see this little while, he must remain for a little while, a short time. The same idea in Revelation 7, in Revelation 12, and it's referring to the dragon, right? Remember, again, in Revelation 16, we also see the idea of this unholy trinity, verse 13, and I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. So we know these symbols of the beast, and we said the two beasts that we saw in Revelation 13, we said one was like a false prophet because his actions was to get you to worship the first beast, right? So, and they both received their power from the serpent, from the dragon. Right? So this is this unholy trinity. Right? And we see the unclean spirits coming up out of them to go and stir up the kings of the earth for war. This great day of God. Right? And so here we get this idea that, again, there's these 7 kings, 5 have fallen, one is, the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast, then it describes the beast, which was and is not, so connecting it back to up here, verse 8, is himself also an eighth, and is one of the 7, right? And so this tells me that now this is not just literal kings is the purpose of this. So, we need to figure out, how many nations have come? So we got 5 nations have passed, and this king, this particular king, this nation. The point of this passage is to show us the demonic powers operating behind these figures right here, right? That's why it ties it back into the beast, which was and is not, and it's himself an eighth, and it's one of the 7, right? And so it goes on to say he goes to destruction. Then 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. So where do we get these 10 kingdoms from? Again, going back to this depiction of this great war, right? Here it describes them as the kings of the whole earth. And who are the kings of the whole earth being stirred up by? The demonic spirits, right? And so when we go back to Revelation 17, it says the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and their authority to the beast. So now we go back to this operation of authority that's been given now. So the kings give their power and authority to the beast, and the beast has received this power and authority from the dragon, right? These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. So now I take this to be pointing us back to the war, the great war that was stirred up in the pouring out of the fifth bowl of wrath, right? That brings up the kings of the whole earth against God's king. And then it says, and he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlots sit are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And so now this water that we saw earlier in the depiction, again, now the symbols, the figures change. Now we get an idea of, okay, what does the symbols represent? What are the peoples and the nations? So the woman is described to be on top of these nations, these peoples, shall I say. And then, and the 10 horns which you saw in the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. What is this talking about? What is this referring to? Basically, what you see here is the judgment that is coming to, that's going to come to the nations, right? The beast, right? And what's described as the harlot, which I would say is the worldview. And it's almost as if the nations and the beast is turning against this worldview, this harlot, and being blamed for the judgment and punishment that is about to be given out, right? And so the question is, why would it be blaming the beast and the nations for the judgment, the desolation that it describes, and punishment that's coming to her, right? Because the destruction of the worldview has everything to do with what's happening and what God stirs up right here in a bowl, with what we see in the pouring out of the fifth bowl. And what happens is God stirs up that worldview in their minds to usurp God, to come up against God, which leads them to their destruction, right? And that happens, which we see described clearly here, as these demonic spirits coming up out of the mouth of the beast, the dragon, and a false prophet, right? And what is it doing? It's going up to store up the kings of the whole world to go gather up against God on a great day. So it's almost a tool that God uses to lead the people and nations to their destruction, lead those who embrace this worldview, this system, is the beast, is the unclean spirit, is the serpent, right? And basically, God is now saying here that this is how they turn against the harlot. God uses their worldview to bring them to destruction. All right, and so then we see something very interesting in verse 17. I'm sorry for the noise. For God has put in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast. So again, it's pointing back that this desolation, this desolation, this being burned up with fire, this judgment, this destruction is something that God is the source of. It's his decree. It's his purpose. For God has put in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast. Right? So the handing over of their authority, the kingdom, is them surrendering to the signs and the wonders that stirs them up in their worldview to go up against God's people, God's chosen, until the word of God will be fulfilled. The woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So, again, the woman now is being depicted as a great city. Going back to what we read in Revelation 11. Well, what was described as great cities? Right? We see first there's this idea of the holy city that's been given over to be treaded underfoot. Right? So one would say, well, what is this holy city? Again, I would say this is the earth, the whole earth, because the temple is in heaven. And that which God has given over is what he cast down the serpent to, the earth and the seas, which we see in Revelation 13, the beast coming up out of. And in this holy city, in this place, shall I say, is where we see the people of God being trampled upon, persecuted, right? Which leads us to the recompense. But before we get there, it tells us about a great city. It says, and their dead bodies will lie in a great city, which mystically, symbolically, so we know we're talking in symbols. It's called Sodom. Well, Sodom, we know, is a biblical city that embraced this worldview that was counter opposed to God. They embraced their fallen nature, their wickedness. And we've seen the same thing as Egypt. Again, another city that received the wrath, another kingdom that received the wrath of God. Now it's being referred to as this great city, but they embraced the same worldview that caused the destruction of Sodom. And then it says, where also their Lord was crucified, which will point us to Jerusalem, which also crucified the people. The Jews crucified God because they refused to submit to God. They embraced the same worldview. So how do I take this city to be a worldview, a system of our fallen nature that drives us to destruction? It's because that is what all of these symbols holds in common, that is being described as this great city. All right, and we will land right there for today. Thanks for joining in on this study, and I ask that you join in on our Bible studies every Wednesday, 5:30 Mountain Standard Time. I try to have at least a discussion and cover some of these things more in detail, and allow for a forum of conversation. But people, what I want us to realize coming up into this section and coming from this section, shall I say, is that this is what we look forward to as Christians. This we don't have any wrath to deliver to those on this earth. We are called to do one thing: remain faithful, hold fast to the testimony of Christ, even until death. Even until death. Some of us may never know or be afflicted and persecuted to the intensity that we see and read about in the Great Tribulation. But we're all participating in this tribulation, this affliction. We all experience this in some way, even in ways that you may not even realize. Right? We don't even realize how hard it is to remain faithful to God, to do what's pleasing to God in a world, in the midst of people who embraces this system, this worldview of wanting to usurp God in their lives. And what does that worldview look like? Well, it looked like what we saw in the garden in the beginning. The serpent. Did God really say you shouldn't eat from the tree of life? Did God really say that a woman shouldn't speak in orderly worship? Did God really say when you prophesy or pray, you should wear a head covering? Right? Did God really say that we should pray and let our righteous deed be in private and not a public spectacle? Right? Come on. There can't be anything wrong with these things. I mean, come on. God surely would receive glory. He surely would receive worship through these things. Right? This is no different than what happened with Saul and Samuel. When Saul told Samuel, after God had sent them to the Ammonites to destroy all the Ammonites, and he said, leave not anything, kill everything. But Saul decided to do what Saul wanted to do. Oh, I spared the king, God. I left all the good things to be a dedication to you. And Samuel told Saul, obedience is better than sacrifice. You see, the root of this fallen worldview is us embracing our own knowledge of good and evil to do what we want to do, which causes us to not submit to God, to depend on God. Therefore, in Romans 8, it says, the natural man, the man of the flesh, he cannot submit himself to God. He can't even do it. It's impossible. Only one who has the Spirit of God. So people, if you don't know the Lord, if you're still embracing this fallen nature of yours to do things your way, God's recompense is upon you. Judgment is upon you, and you do harm and participate in the pouring out of the blood of the saints just by embracing that worldview. You deserve the recompense that is laid out before you in this book. So I beseech you, flee from your immoralities, flee from your fallen nature, and cling to the work of the beloved Son, Jesus Christ. Until the next time, be blessed.